Hey there YouTube, this is going to be my response to Gerard, Wolfkang1, who re-tagged me after I tagged him with a slight modification to the original tag. The original tag was if you had access to a time machine and you could visit any period in history and talk to anyone, where would you go and who would you speak to? Gerard modified it slightly. It's becoming sort of the tag equivalent of Chinese whispers, which is very cool indeed. I rather like that idea. It would be very cool if some way down the line the tag returned to me and it was completely different from what it started as, and you could trace the history of it and the evolution of it throughout YouTube. That would be great. Anyway, Gerard altered it slightly by posing the question, if you could alter something, if you could change something in history, what would it be? Now, I find this really difficult to answer for a number of reasons. There are complications with the notion of changing history, philosophical complications that make it almost impossible to give a definite answer, for me anyway. It seems to me that most people who do give an answer to this question base their response on a sense of humanism. It's usually as a means of preventing suffering or of saving lives. Obviously one of the significant ones is preventing the Second World War. But it seems to me the only way one can legitimately provide an answer to this, a definite answer to this question, is if one has a non-linear view of time, if one has a certain degree of omniscience. Let's assume that you did go back in time and you somehow prevented the Second World War from happening. You would undoubtedly save the lives of many, 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 many people, at least in the short term. But let's assume that the knock-on effects of preventing the Second World War result in something worse, or in the long run result in more suffering. It's entirely likely. One has to consider, for example, that as a result of the First and Second World Wars, certain medical and technological advancements were made which are now saving hundreds and hundreds of lives. This is obviously little consolation to those who were actually killed in the Second World War, and certainly to their loved ones. But since we are talking about changing history here, it seems to me that one has to regard the entire situation in a more abstract fashion rather than with regards to individual lives. It becomes a matter of numbers ultimately. How many can you save? And in that regard, preventing something like the Second World War may be a terrible thing to do, depending on what its knock-on effects actually are, or what they potentially could be. In order to legitimately make that decision, one would be able to have to perceive every conceivable ramification of your actions, every conceivable consequence of preventing the Second World War. And one would have to be able to measure whether it would be a good or a bad thing in a humanistic sense. How many lives would it benefit? How many lives would it not? And I'm just using the Second World War as an example here. I mean, this goes for any event that has occurred in history. And in order to be able to perceive those consequences, every single potential consequence, one would have to be able to regard time not in the fashion that we linear and finite beings do. One would effectively have to be God. One would have to be a god, or have certain qualities of divinity in order to make that decision. It may very well be in that regard that events such as the Second World War have to happen. And I don't mean in a sort of mystic, predeterministic way. I mean that in a very practical and humanistic way, merely in terms of the consequences to humanity. Events such as the Second World War may have to happen. We can't say one way or the other, because we lack the capacity to to perceive and conceive of all of the consequences of the Second World War either happening or not happening, because our perceptions of time and eventuality and possibility are finite. Furthermore, there are loads of philosophical problems with the very notion of changing history. There is one school of thought that says one cannot change history. Regardless of what one does, history must occur as it has always occurred, because of course it has to lead up to the incarnation of yourself, who has the intention to go back and to change it in the first place. And in that regard, you become a paradox. History is inevitable, and regardless of what you do, it will find a way to assimilate your interference and flow as it has always flowed. That's only one school of thought, of course. As the time traveller, you merely become part of the general flow of events that leads up to the inevitability. And there are various science fiction short stories and movies and whatnot dealing with this concept. There are then issues such as the grandfather paradox as well. The grandfather paradox states that by going back in time, you may end up either becoming or murdering your own grandfather. And of course it doesn't mean this literally. What it is actually saying is that by the simple fact of travelling in time, you are upsetting the flow of events that leads up to your existence. And you are having such profound ramifications for the flow of history that you are, in effect, a cataclysm waiting to happen. By the mere fact of your existing in a time that isn't your own, you are affecting events, you are displacing air that wouldn't otherwise be displaced. And you are therefore altering history in profound, potentially very profound ways. So to simply answer the question, I can't answer it. I wouldn't feel right changing anything in history, not even the smallest thing. Because even the smallest thing is like a pebble dropped into a pond. It has, the ripples travel on and on and on, and the energy that perpetuates those ripples doesn't die, it doesn't wane, it merely changes form. And that's the problem. The time traveller is potentially the pebble in the pond, and sometimes a boulder, sometimes an asteroid. The only way I would feel comfortable changing anything is if I could perceive time in the way I've already detailed it. That is, I could perceive every potential consequence, or every single way in which reality might conform given one set of circumstances or one particular action. That's the only way. Otherwise, all you're doing is hoping for the best. You're changing something that might have what seemed to initially be positive results, but which later down the line may have very, 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 very grave consequences indeed. In fact, it's excellent fodder for fiction, this sort of thing. What would have happened if the Second World War had not occurred? What would have happened if the Holocaust didn't occur? What would realistically be the consequences, say, 5 decades down the line? What would have happened if Christianity had never come to Europe or Britain? It's absolutely fascinating fodder for thought, and I would love to see some video responses or some responses in the comment section below this video on what people think